My name is Michael, and today I'm going to tell you about the moment God spoke directly into the chaos of my mind, with words that brought peace to a storm I thought would never end. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if this story resonates with your heart. Share it with someone you love who might be struggling with anxiety or racing thoughts. And please, leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with finding God's peace in the midst of mental chaos. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in September 2023, and I was sitting on my kitchen floor, back against the refrigerator, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through an endless loop of worries, scenarios, and what-if situations that had kept me awake for the third night in a row. At 31 years old, I had built what looked like a successful life from the outside: a thriving architecture firm, a beautiful home, respect from my peers. But inside my head was a battlefield that never knew peace. The thoughts came in waves, relentless and overwhelming. What if the Johnson project falls through? What if I made the wrong design choice? What if my business partner decides to leave? What if the economy crashes? What if I'm not as talented as people think? What if I'm just fooling everyone, including myself? Each thought spawned 10 more, creating an endless spiral of anxiety that felt like drowning in my own mind. I had been struggling with what my doctor called anxiety and obsessive thought patterns for as long as I could remember, but it had gotten significantly worse over the past 2 years as my business grew and the pressure mounted. Success, ironically, had made everything worse. The more I achieved, the more I had to lose, and the more my mind fixated on every possible way things could go wrong. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, glowing with half-finished emails I'd been trying to write for hours. Simple messages to clients had become impossible tasks because my brain would analyze every word, every phrase, wondering if I sounded too casual or too formal, too confident or too desperate. I would write and rewrite the same sentence 15 times, never satisfied, never certain I was communicating exactly what I meant. Sleep had become my enemy. The moment my head hit the pillow, my mind would shift into overdrive, reviewing every conversation from the day, analyzing every decision I'd made, planning for problems that might never happen. I would lie there for hours, physically exhausted, but mentally wired, trapped in a prison of my own thoughts. Even during the day, when I should have been focused on my work, my mind would jump from one concern to another like a pinball machine that never stopped. I'd be in the middle of designing a building, and suddenly I'd be thinking about a comment my assistant made 3 days ago, wondering if she was unhappy with her job, if I should give her a raise, if she was planning to quit, if I was a bad boss, if I needed to hire someone else, if I could afford another employee, if the business was really as stable as it seemed. The mental exhaustion was overwhelming. By evening, I felt like I'd run a marathon, not because of physical work, but because my brain had been sprinting all day, chasing thoughts that led nowhere productive. I tried everything I could think of: meditation apps, exercise, cutting back on caffeine, even prescription medication that made me feel numb but didn't quiet the chaos. That particular night, the anxiety had reached a breaking point. I'd spent the entire day second-guessing a major design decision for a client, calling and texting my business partner Jake repeatedly for reassurance, researching building codes I already knew by heart, and generally making myself sick with worry over something that was probably fine. "This can't be how I'm supposed to live," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "God, if you're there, if you're listening, I need help. My mind won't stop. I can't turn it off. I can't find peace anywhere. I'm so tired of being afraid of my own thoughts." The words came out broken, desperate, like a prayer from someone who had tried everything else and had nowhere left to turn. I wasn't even sure I believed God would answer. I had grown up in church, but over the years, faith had taken a back seat to achievement, success, and the relentless pursuit of perfection that fed my anxiety. What happened next changed everything. In the silence that followed my desperate prayer, I heard something that wasn't quite an audible voice, but was clearer than any sound I'd ever experienced. Deep in my spirit, cutting through the noise of my racing thoughts like a lighthouse beam through fog, came these words, "Michael, your mind doesn't stop, but I am your clarity." The peace that washed over me was immediate and profound. It wasn't that my thoughts suddenly stopped. They didn't. But for the first time in years, I experienced something beyond the chaos. It was like discovering that while there might be a storm on the surface of the ocean, there were depths below where everything was calm and still. The phrase, "I am your clarity," hit me with particular force. God wasn't promising to turn off my racing mind or cure my anxiety overnight. He was offering something better, to be the clear, steady voice of truth in the midst of the mental noise. While my thoughts might continue to race, he would be the constant, unchanging source of peace and direction I could anchor to. I sat there on the kitchen floor for what felt like hours, just absorbing this new understanding. My mind was still active, still generating thoughts and concerns, but they no longer felt overwhelming. It was like God had given me a different relationship with my own thoughts. Instead of being at their mercy, I could observe them from a place of peace. For the first time in months, sleep came easily that night. Not because my mind had stopped racing, but because I had found something more powerful than my racing thoughts. A source of clarity that existed beyond the chaos, a peace that was deeper than my anxiety. When I woke up the next morning, I felt different. The thoughts were still there, concerns about work, questions about decisions, the familiar mental chatter that had been my constant companion. But now I had something else. The memory of God's voice cutting through the noise, the promise that He was my clarity, and the beginning of hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to be a prisoner of my own mind anymore. This was the beginning of the most incredible journey of learning to live with anxiety while being anchored to something greater than my fears. Over the weeks and months that followed, I would discover what it really means to find God's clarity in the midst of mental chaos, and how His peace can coexist with a mind that simply doesn't stop. If you're reading this and struggling with racing thoughts, anxiety, or the exhausting feeling that your mind never gives you rest, I want you to know that God sees your struggle. He doesn't promise to take away every anxious thought, but He offers something better, to be your clarity, your anchor, your source of peace in the storm. You don't have to fight this battle alone. The morning after God spoke to me brought a strange mixture of peace and uncertainty. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months, but as consciousness fully returned, so did the familiar parade of thoughts. The difference was that now I had something to hold on to, the memory of God's voice cutting through the chaos with the promise that He was my clarity. My morning routine felt different, though the thoughts themselves hadn't changed much. As I made coffee, my mind still jumped from concern to concern. Did I lock the front door last night? What if that client email I sent yesterday sounded too casual? Should I call Jake about the Henderson project? What if we're behind schedule? But underneath the mental chatter, there was something new, a quiet confidence that I wasn't alone in navigating these thoughts. I decided to try something I hadn't done in years. I opened my dusty Bible and attempted to read while my mind was still racing. Normally, I would have given up after 30 seconds, frustrated by my inability to concentrate. But remembering God's words about being my clarity, I persisted through the mental noise. I found myself in Philippians 4, and verse 7 seemed to jump off the page. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The phrase transcends all understanding resonated deeply. Maybe God's peace wasn't meant to be something I could mentally comprehend or control. Maybe it was meant to exist beyond my thoughts altogether. At work that morning, I faced my first real test of this new understanding. The Henderson project, A major commercial building design that represented the largest contract our firm had ever landed was due for a crucial presentation to the City Planning Committee in 2 days. Normally, this deadline would send my anxiety into overdrive, with my mind spinning through every possible catastrophe. Sure enough, as I reviewed the plans, the thoughts came flooding in. What if there's an error we missed? What if the zoning requirements have changed? What if they reject the entire proposal? What if this ruins our reputation? What if we lose the contract? What if this destroys the business? But this time, instead of being swept away by the mental storm, I remembered God's promise. I am your clarity. I took a deep breath and tried something new. Instead of fighting the anxious thoughts or trying to shut them down, I acknowledged them and then asked a simple question. God, what's the truth here? Almost immediately, a different kind of thought emerged. Calmer, clearer, more grounded in reality. You've checked the plans 3 times. Jake reviewed everything twice. The zoning compliance was verified last week. You've done good work here. Trust the process. It wasn't that the anxious thoughts disappeared, but they no longer had the power to overwhelm me. God's clarity provided a steady counterpoint to the mental chaos, like a lighthouse beam that remained constant even while storms raged around it. Jake, my business partner, noticed the difference almost immediately when he walked into my office around 10 a.m. Normally, on a day like this, he would find me surrounded by papers, frantically double-checking calculations, or pacing the floor while verbally processing every possible concern. You seem different today, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Calmer. Did you finally try that meditation app I recommended? I laughed, realizing how obvious the change must be. Something like that. I had an encounter with God last night that I'm still processing. Jake raised his eyebrows. We'd been friends since college, and while he knew about my church background, we rarely discussed faith in the context of work. What kind of encounter? I found myself sharing about the sleepless night, the desperate prayer, and God's response about being my clarity. As I spoke, I watched Jake's expression shift from skeptical curiosity to genuine interest. That's actually really beautiful, he said when I finished. I've watched you struggle with anxiety for years, and nothing seemed to help for long. If this God thing brings you peace, I'm all for it. Jake's response surprised me. I had expected him to be uncomfortable with talk about God speaking to me, but instead he seemed relieved to see me finding some measure of peace. The afternoon brought another test when Mrs. Peterson, our most demanding client, called with concerns about her house design. Normally, a call from Mrs. Peterson would send my anxiety through the roof. She had a talent for finding problems where none existed and expressing dissatisfaction in ways that made me question every decision I'd ever made. Michael, she began in her familiar tone of barely contained irritation, I've been thinking about the kitchen layout, and I'm not sure the island placement is optimal. What if we need to move it? What if the whole flow is wrong? I've been losing sleep over this. The irony of Mrs. Peterson losing sleep over design decisions wasn't lost on me. As she continued voicing her concerns, I felt the familiar tug of anxiety trying to pull me into her spiral of worry. But this time, I had something to hold on to. Instead of immediately agreeing with her concerns or launching into defensive explanations of our design choices, I took a breath and asked for God's clarity. What emerged was a calm, confident response I wouldn't have been capable of the day before. Mrs. Peterson, I understand your concerns, and they're valid questions to consider. Why don't we schedule a time for you to come in, and we can walk through the design together? I can show you the reasoning behind each placement, and if there are adjustments that would make you more comfortable, we can explore those options. By the end of the call, Mrs. Peterson sounded calmer, and we had a plan for moving forward. More importantly, I hadn't absorbed her anxiety or made it my own. God's clarity had provided a buffer between her stress and my peace. That evening, I decided to call my sister Emma, who had been suggesting for years that I see a therapist about my anxiety. She lived across the country, but we talked regularly, and she had become my unofficial counselor for dealing with stress. "Michael," she answered on the second ring. "How are you? You sound different, good different." I told her about the previous night's experience and the day I'd just had. Emma listened intently, occasionally asking questions or making small sounds of understanding. "That's incredible," she said when I finished. "I've been praying for you for years, asking God to give you peace. It sounds like He finally answered in a way you could hear." "You've been praying for me?" "Of course I have. Watching you struggle with your thoughts and not being able to help from 3,000 miles away. Prayer was all I had. I'm so glad God met you in that moment." Emma's revelation touched me deeply. While I had been fighting my mental battles alone, thinking no one understood, she had been interceding for me, asking God to provide exactly what He had given me, clarity in the chaos. Before we hung up, Emma said something that stayed with me. "Michael, what if your racing mind isn't a flaw to be fixed, but a gift to be stewarded? What if God can use your ability to see multiple angles and think through complex scenarios? But now you have His clarity to guide which thoughts to focus on and which ones to let go." That night, as I prepared for bed, I felt cautiously optimistic. The thoughts were still there. Concerns about tomorrow's work, questions about the presentation, general anxiety about various aspects of life, but they no longer felt like a tsunami threatening to drown me. Instead, they felt like waves on the surface, while I remained anchored to something deeper and more stable. I whispered a prayer of gratitude. "God, thank you for speaking to me last night. Thank you for being my clarity today. Help me learn to distinguish between your voice and the noise in my head. Teach me to live with a racing mind while staying anchored to your peace." Sleep came more easily again, not because my mind had stopped, but because I had learned the difference between the chaos of anxious thoughts and the calm certainty of God's clarity. Tomorrow would bring new tests of this newfound peace, but for the first time in years, I was looking forward to seeing how God would continue to be my anchor in the storm. The day of the Henderson Project presentation arrived with all the weight I had anticipated, but something fundamental had shifted in how I carried that weight. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, adjusting my tie for the third time, while my mind ran through every possible scenario, I felt the familiar anxiety rising, but underneath it was something new, a steady confidence that I wasn't facing this alone. What if they hate the design? What if we missed a critical regulation? What if the budget projections are wrong? What if this ruins everything we've worked for? The thoughts came as predictably as sunrise, but this time I had a response ready. "God," I whispered to my reflection, "you said you are my clarity. Help me see this situation clearly, not through the lens of fear." Almost immediately, a calmer perspective emerged. "You've prepared well. The design is solid. Jake believes in it. The research is thorough. You can only control your effort, not the outcome. Trust the process." The drive to City Hall with Jake felt different than usual. Normally, I would have spent the entire trip verbally processing every concern, asking him to reassure me about details we had already confirmed multiple times. Instead, I found myself able to have an actual conversation. "You seem remarkably calm for someone about to present a $1 million project," Jake observed as we pulled into the parking lot. "I'm not calm," I admitted. "My mind is still racing with all the usual worries. But I'm learning to distinguish between the noise and the truth. The noise says we're about to fail spectacularly. The truth says we've done good work and we're prepared." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I like this version of you. You're still thorough and detail-oriented, but you're not drowning in worst-case scenarios." The presentation room was exactly as intimidating as I had imagined. A large conference table surrounded by city officials, each with stacks of documents and serious expressions. As we set up our materials, my heart rate increased and the mental chatter intensified. What if the projector doesn't work properly? What if I forget something important? What if they ask questions I can't answer? What if my voice shakes? What if I sound unprofessional? But instead of being paralyzed by these thoughts, I did something I'd never tried before in a high-stakes situation. I silently asked God for his clarity about what was really happening here. The answer came as a shift in perspective. These people want this project to succeed. They're not enemies waiting to tear you down. They're potential partners, hoping you have a solution to their needs. Focus on serving them, not on protecting yourself. When it came time to present, I felt something I hadn't experienced in professional settings before, a sense of purpose beyond my own performance anxiety. Instead of seeing the presentation as a test of my worth, I began to see it as an opportunity to offer something valuable to the community. As I walked through the design plans, explaining how the commercial building would serve local businesses while enhancing the neighborhood's character, I noticed that my usual self-consciousness had been replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the project. The thoughts were still there. Am I talking too fast? Do I sound confident enough? What if they think this idea is stupid? But they weren't controlling me anymore. Halfway through the presentation, something remarkable happened. City Councilwoman Martinez asked a question about sustainable building materials that I hadn't anticipated, and instead of panicking, I felt God's clarity guide my response. "That's an excellent question," I said, and meant it. While our initial proposal focuses on cost-effective traditional materials, we actually researched several sustainable alternatives that could be incorporated if the budget allows. Let me show you those options. As I pulled up additional slides Jake and I had prepared but hadn't planned to use, I realized that my thorough, anxious preparation, which I had always seen as a symptom of my mental struggles, was actually serving a valuable purpose. God wasn't taking away my tendency to think through multiple scenarios. He was helping me channel it productively. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, and with each one, I felt more confident in my ability to provide thoughtful, well-researched answers. My mind's habit of considering every possible angle, which usually felt like a curse, was actually an asset in this environment. When we finished, the response was overwhelmingly positive. The planning committee approved the project with minor modifications, and several members complimented our thoroughness and attention to detail. "Mr. Stevens," said Committee Chairman Roberts as we packed up our materials, "this is one of the most comprehensive proposals we've seen. It's clear you've thought through every aspect of this project. We're excited to move forward." In the car afterward, Jake was practically glowing with excitement. "Michael, that was incredible. You were so confident, so prepared, so present. Usually, after presentations like that, you spend the entire drive home, analyzing every word you said and worrying about what you should have done differently." He was right. Normally, the post-presentation anxiety would be just as intense as the pre-presentation worry, with my mind replaying every moment and finding fault with my performance. But this time, I felt genuinely peaceful about what had happened. "I think I'm finally learning what God meant when he said he was my clarity," I told Jake. "It's not that the anxious thoughts stop coming. They don't. But now I have something more reliable to guide me than my own fears." That afternoon, back at the office, I faced a new test of this developing understanding. Sarah, our office manager, approached me with concerns about our billing system. Normally, administrative issues would send my mind spiraling through worst-case scenarios about cash flow, client satisfaction, and business stability. "Michael, I've been reviewing our accounts, and I think we need to have a conversation about some discrepancies," she said, holding a folder of financial documents. The familiar anxiety surge began immediately. What kind of discrepancies? Did we overcharge someone? Did we miss payments? Are we in financial trouble? What if we've been making accounting errors? What if this affects our reputation? But before the thoughts could overwhelm me, I remembered to ask for God's clarity. What's the truth here beyond my fear? The answer came as a calmer assessment. Sarah is being proactive by bringing this to your attention. Discrepancies don't automatically mean disasters. Listen to what she's actually saying before assuming the worst. Tell me more about what you found, I said, gesturing for her to sit down. As Sarah explained, it became clear that the discrepancies were minor formatting issues in our invoicing software, not major financial problems. What could have been a source of days of worry was resolved in a 20-minute conversation and a simple software update. Thanks for catching this, I told Sarah as she prepared to leave. I appreciate you staying on top of these details. After she left, I sat at my desk, marveling at what had just happened. 3 days ago, a conversation like that would have ruined my entire week. Today, it was just a normal business issue that we addressed and resolved. The difference wasn't in the circumstances. It was in my ability to access God's clarity instead of being ruled by my anxious assumptions. That evening, I called Emma to update her on the day's events. "I'm so proud of you," she said after I described the presentation and the billing conversation. "It sounds like you're learning to work with your mind instead of against it." "What do you mean?" "Well, your tendency to think through every possibility used to be your enemy because it was driven by fear. But today, it sounds like that same thoroughness became your strength because it was guided by wisdom instead of worry." Her observation was profound. God wasn't changing my personality or taking away my analytical nature. He was redeeming it, transforming it from a source of torment into a tool for excellence and service. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with my own thoughts was changing. The mental activity was still there, concerns about tomorrow's work, questions about future projects, the general background noise of an active mind. But I was no longer at war with my thoughts. Instead, I was learning to sort through them with God's help, identifying which ones deserved attention and which ones could be acknowledged and released. "God," I prayed, "thank you for showing me today that you can use even my anxiety for good purposes when it's submitted to your clarity. Help me continue learning to hear your voice above the noise in my head." For the third night in a row, sleep came peacefully, and I found myself actually looking forward to tomorrow's challenges, knowing that I wouldn't face them alone. 2 weeks into this new journey with God's clarity, I faced my most challenging test yet. It came in the form of a phone call at 7:30 a.m. on a Friday morning from Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead physician at the medical center we were designing. Her voice carried an urgency that immediately triggered every anxiety alarm in my system. "Michael, we need to talk immediately. There's been a significant change in the project requirements that could affect everything we've planned." My mind instantly launched into catastrophic mode. Everything we've planned? Does that mean months of work are wasted? What if we have to start over? What if they cancel the contract? What if this destroys our reputation? What if other clients hear about this and lose confidence in us? What if we can't recover financially? But even as the thoughts spiraled, I found myself doing something that was becoming more natural, reaching for God's clarity in the midst of the mental storm. "God, help me hear what's actually being said here, not what my fear is interpreting." Dr. Chen continued, "The hospital board met yesterday and decided to add a pediatric wing to the project. It's actually good news in terms of scope and budget, but it means significant changes to our timeline and design approach." The relief that washed over me was immediately followed by a new wave of anxiety. Significant changes. What if we can't handle the increased scope? What if we're not qualified for pediatric facility design? What if we disappoint them? What if the timeline is impossible to meet? I took a deep breath and asked the question that was becoming my lifeline. "Dr. Chen, can we schedule a meeting today to discuss the details? I'd like to understand exactly what you're envisioning so we can give you an honest assessment of what's possible." After we scheduled the meeting for that afternoon, I sat in my office trying to process what had just happened. The old Michael would have spent the next 6 hours spiraling through worst-case scenarios, calling Jake repeatedly for reassurance, and probably making himself sick with worry. Instead, I found myself able to think strategically about the opportunity while acknowledging the challenges. Jake arrived at the office around 9 and immediately noticed my contemplative mood. "Everything okay? You look like you're processing something big." I filled him in on Dr. Chen's call, watching his expression shift from concern to excitement as I explained the pediatric wing edition. "Michael, this is incredible," he said. "If we can pull this off, it positions us as specialists in medical facility design. This could be a game changer for the firm." "But what if we can't pull it off?" I asked, voicing the fear that was still circling in my mind. "What if we're in over our heads? What if we promise something we can't deliver?" Jake studied my face for a moment. "You know what I'm noticing? You're asking what-if questions, but you're not spiraling into panic. You're actually thinking through the challenges instead of being paralyzed by them. That's huge progress." His observation was accurate. The anxious thoughts were still there, but they felt more like information to consider rather than verdicts about impending doom. God's clarity was teaching me the difference between productive concern and destructive worry. I spent the morning researching pediatric facility design requirements, reaching out to colleagues who had experience in specialized medical architecture, and preparing thoughtful questions for our meeting with Dr. Chen. My mind's tendency to think through every possible angle was finally working for me instead of against me. The meeting that afternoon was a revelation in multiple ways. Dr. Chen, along with the hospital administrator and head of pediatrics, outlined their vision for a child-friendly medical environment that would ease anxiety for young patients and their families. "We want this space to feel less like a hospital and more like a place where children can feel safe and even excited to visit," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the pediatrics department head. "Think bright colors, interactive elements, maybe even some play areas integrated into the treatment spaces." As she spoke, something clicked in my mind. My own experience with anxiety, my understanding of how environment affects mental state, my recent journey of finding peace in the midst of chaos. All of this was relevant to designing spaces that would help anxious children feel calm. "Dr. Martinez," I said, feeling inspired, "what if we approach this from the perspective of anxiety reduction? I've been learning recently about how environment can either amplify or reduce stress. What if we designed not just for physical healing, but for emotional comfort?" The conversation that followed was one of the most energizing professional discussions I'd ever had. We talked about natural lighting to reduce institutional feelings, interactive art installations to provide positive distractions, and design elements that would help children feel they had some control in an otherwise overwhelming situation. "This is exactly what we were hoping for," Dr. Chen said as the meeting concluded. "You understand that pediatric care isn't just about medical treatment. It's about creating an experience that supports the whole child and family." Driving back to the office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete alignment between my personal struggles and my professional calling. God wasn't just giving me clarity for my own anxiety. He was using my experience with mental chaos to help create healing environments for others. That evening, I decided to call my parents for the first time since God had spoken to me. I hadn't shared my anxiety struggles with them, partly out of pride and partly because I didn't want them to worry. But something about the day's breakthrough made me want to connect with them. "Michael," my mother answered warmly, "what a wonderful surprise." "How are you, sweetheart?" I found myself sharing more honestly than I had in years about the anxiety I'd been struggling with, about the night God spoke to me, and about how this new project seemed to be connecting my personal journey with my professional purpose. My father, who had always been a man of few words but deep faith, spoke up when I finished. "Son, I've been praying for you for years. I could see you carrying a heavy load, even when you were achieving great things. I'm so glad God met you in your struggle. You've been praying for me too?" I asked, thinking of Emma's similar revelation. "Every day," my mother added. "We could see the stress you were under, but we didn't know how to help without seeming like we were intruding. We just kept asking God to give you peace." The realization that both my sister and my parents had been interceding for me while I thought I was fighting alone brought tears to my eyes. God's clarity wasn't just about managing my racing thoughts. It was about recognizing the community of love and support that had been surrounding me all along. "There's something else," my father said. "Your grandmother struggled with what they called nervous thoughts her whole life. She used to tell me that God taught her the difference between the voice of fear and the voice of truth. It sounds like you're learning the same lesson." Lin, this family history of anxiety was news to me, but it also felt like another piece of God's preparation. My struggles weren't a defect or a failure. They were part of a larger story of learning to find God's peace in the midst of mental storms. Before we hung up, my mother said something that stayed with me. "Michael, what if God allowed you to experience this struggle so you could help others find the same peace you're discovering? What if your anxiety is actually preparing you to be a source of comfort and understanding for other people who feel overwhelmed?" That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the day's events. The pediatric hospital project felt like more than just a business opportunity. It felt like a calling to use my understanding of anxiety and peace to create healing environments for others. God's clarity was expanding beyond my personal mental health to encompass my professional purpose. "God," I prayed, "thank you for showing me today that even my struggles can be used to serve others. Help me design spaces that bring the same peace to anxious children and families that you've been teaching me to find in my own life." The thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Concerns about the project timeline, questions about design approaches, the usual mental activity of an engaged mind. But they felt different now, less like threats and more like the raw material from which God could create something beautiful and healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to practice living with God's clarity in the midst of mental activity, and I found myself genuinely excited to see how He would continue to transform my racing mind into a tool for serving others. A month into working on the pediatric wing design, I discovered that God's clarity was about to be tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. It started with what should have been a routine meeting with the hospital's construction manager, Tom Rodriguez, who had some concerns about our proposed timeline. "Michael, I need to be straight with you," Tom said, as we spread the construction plans across the conference table. "The timeline you've outlined is ambitious, maybe too ambitious. What if we hit delays with specialized equipment installation? What if the pediatric safe materials take longer to source than expected? What if city inspections for medical facilities are more complex than we're anticipating?" The familiar anxiety surge began immediately, but this time it felt different, more intense, more persistent. What if he's right? What if we've promised something impossible? What if this project fails and ruins our reputation? What if Dr. Chen loses confidence in us? What if other medical facilities hear about our failure? What if this destroys the business we've worked so hard to build? I tried to access God's clarity the way I had been learning to do, but the thoughts felt more overwhelming than usual. Instead of the calm, steady voice of truth, I was hearing only the escalating volume of my own fears. "Let me review these concerns and get back to you," I told Tom, trying to maintain a professional demeanor while feeling like I was drowning internally. The rest of that day was a struggle I hadn't experienced since before God spoke to me. The anxious thoughts came in waves that seemed impossible to navigate. By evening, I was pacing my apartment, my mind racing through scenario after scenario of potential failure, and I couldn't seem to find the peace that had become my anchor. "God, where are you?" I prayed desperately. "I can't hear your clarity tonight. All I can hear is fear, and it's louder than it's been in weeks. Did I imagine your voice before? Am I losing the peace you gave me?" What followed was one of the longest nights I'd had since my initial breakthrough. Sleep was elusive, and when it did come, it was filled with anxiety dreams about project failures and professional disasters. I woke up the next morning feeling like I was back where I started, trapped in my own mind with no way out. Jake noticed my distress immediately when I arrived at the office. "You look terrible," he said with characteristic directness. "What happened? Yesterday you were excited about the project, and today you look like you haven't slept in a week." I explained about the meeting with Tom and the night of anxiety that followed. "I thought I had figured this out," I said. "I thought God's clarity was going to be my permanent solution to anxiety, but last night felt like I was right back where I started." Jake listened thoughtfully, then said something that surprised me. "Michael, maybe the solution isn't about never having anxiety again. Maybe it's about learning to trust God's clarity, even when you can't feel it clearly." His words hit me like a revelation. I had been treating God's clarity like a feeling or an experience I could control or maintain through my own effort. But what if it was more like faith, something that exists independently of my emotional state? That afternoon, I decided to call my sister Emma for guidance. When I described the previous night's struggle, her response was both comforting and challenging. "Michael, do you remember when I was learning to drive and Dad took me out on the highway for the first time? I was so scared I could barely see the road. But Dad didn't take over the steering wheel. He just kept reminding me that he was there and that I knew how to drive." She paused, letting the analogy sink in. "Maybe last night wasn't God abandoning you. Maybe it was Him teaching you that His clarity isn't dependent on your ability to feel peaceful. Maybe He's still your clarity even when your mind is racing." Emma's insight sparked something in me. I began to realize that I had been expecting God's clarity to eliminate anxiety rather than help me navigate through it. But what if the goal wasn't to never have racing thoughts again, but to trust God's truth even when those thoughts were loud? That evening, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of praying for the anxiety to go away, I prayed for wisdom to discern God's voice in the midst of the mental noise. "God, even if I can't feel your peace right now, help me to trust that you are still my clarity. Show me the truth about this project situation." What emerged wasn't the dramatic peace I had experienced before, but a quieter, steadier sense of direction. I found myself able to think more objectively about Tom's concerns. Were they valid? Yes. Were they insurmountable? Not necessarily. Could we address them proactively? Absolutely. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research and problem solving with a focus I hadn't experienced before. Instead of being paralyzed by the possibility of delays, I began developing contingency plans. I reached out to suppliers to get realistic timelines for specialized materials. I scheduled a meeting with the city's medical facility inspection team to understand their requirements thoroughly. My mind was still racing with thoughts and concerns, but now those thoughts felt like tools rather than weapons. The mental activity that had always felt like a curse was becoming a strategic advantage. The breakthrough came during a meeting with the entire project team, Dr. Chen, Tom Rodriguez, Jake, and myself. Instead of presenting our original timeline as non-negotiable, I laid out 3 different scenarios: optimistic, realistic, and conservative. "Tom's concerns are valid," I began, "and rather than ignore them, we've developed plans that account for potential delays while still meeting the hospital's needs." As I walked through each scenario, explaining the research behind our timelines and the contingencies we'd developed for various challenges, I watched the room's energy shift from anxiety to confidence. "This is exactly what we needed," Dr. Chen said. "You've shown us that you're not just promising the impossible, you're planning for success while preparing for challenges." Tom nodded approvingly. "This level of preparation gives me confidence that we can handle whatever comes up during construction." After the meeting, Jake pulled me aside. "Michael, what you just did was incredible. You took a potential crisis and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate our competence. But more than that, you seem completely at peace with the uncertainty." "I wasn't at peace," I admitted. "My mind was racing the entire time, but I think I'm learning the difference between having anxious thoughts and being controlled by them. God's clarity isn't about having a quiet mind. It's about having a reliable guide through a noisy mind." That evening I called my grandmother, The one my father had mentioned struggled with nervous thoughts her whole life. At 86, her voice was still strong and her wisdom sharper than ever. "Grandma, Dad told me you dealt with anxiety throughout your life. How did you manage it? How did you find peace?" She was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the authority of someone who had fought this battle for decades. "Oh, sweetheart, I never found peace by making the thoughts stop. I found peace by learning to recognize God's voice above the noise. Some days his voice was clear as a bell, and some days I had to strain to hear it, but it was always there." She continued, "The thoughts never stopped coming, Michael. Even now, at my age, my mind can race with worries about things I can't control. But I learned that God's truth isn't louder than my fears. It's steadier. It doesn't shout down the anxiety. It just keeps speaking truth until I remember to listen." Her words resonated deeply with my recent experience. God's clarity wasn't about overwhelming the noise in my head. It was about providing a constant, reliable source of truth that I could choose to focus on, regardless of how loud my thoughts became. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on what I was learning. The past month had taught me that God's promise to be my clarity wasn't a one-time solution to anxiety. It was an ongoing relationship with truth that would require daily choice and trust. "God," I prayed, "thank you for being my clarity, even when I can't feel it clearly. Help me to trust your voice above the noise in my head, whether that noise is loud or quiet, whether your voice feels strong or faint. Teach me to live anchored to your truth, regardless of my emotional state." The thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Concerns about the project, questions about future challenges, the usual mental activity of an engaged mind. But I was learning that God's clarity didn't require the absence of thoughts. It just required my willingness to trust his voice above all the others. 6 weeks into the pediatric wing project, I experienced something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. I began to see my anxiety as a gift rather than a curse. This shift in perspective started during a conversation with Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatrics, about designing spaces that would help anxious children feel safe. "Michael, I've been thinking about our last meeting," she said as we walked through the current pediatric unit, observing how children and families interacted with the space. "You mentioned approaching design from the perspective of anxiety reduction. I'm curious, how do you understand anxiety so well? Your insights seem very personal." The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the professional aspects of the project that I hadn't considered how much my personal experience was informing my design choices. For a moment, my mind raced with the familiar concerns. Should I share my struggles with a client? What if she thinks I'm unprofessional? What if she loses confidence in my ability to handle the project? But then I remembered my grandmother's words about God's truth being steadier than my fears, and I felt a quiet confidence about being honest. "Dr. Martinez, I've struggled with anxiety and racing thoughts for most of my adult life. Recently, I've been learning to manage that struggle in a healthier way, and I think that experience is helping me understand what anxious children might need in a medical environment." Her response surprised me. Instead of concern or professional distance, her eyes lit up with interest and appreciation. "That's incredibly valuable insight," she said. "Most architects design pediatric spaces based on what they think children need, but you're designing from a place of actually understanding what it feels like to be overwhelmed by worry. That's going to make all the difference." As we continued our walk through the unit, I found myself seeing the space through the eyes of an anxious child. The fluorescent lighting that felt harsh and institutional, the long, empty corridors that could amplify feelings of isolation, the clinical color scheme that reinforced the medical nature of the experience rather than providing comfort. "What if we incorporated elements that give children a sense of control?" I suggested. "Interactive wall displays, where they can choose colors or sounds, spaces where they can retreat if they feel overwhelmed, design elements that help them focus on positive distractions when medical procedures feel scary." Dr. Martinez nodded enthusiastically. Yes, you're thinking like someone who understands that anxiety isn't just about being scared, it's about feeling powerless and overwhelmed. Giving children small choices and positive focal points could make a huge difference. That afternoon, I sat in my office sketching design concepts with a level of passion and purpose I hadn't felt in years. Every element I drew was informed by my own journey with anxiety, understanding what made feelings of chaos worse and what brought clarity and calm. Jake walked by my desk and paused to look at my sketches. These are incredible, Michael, but they're also different from anything we've designed before. Where is this coming from? I explained my conversation with Dr. Martinez and the realization that my personal struggles were actually enhancing my professional capabilities. That's amazing, Jake said. You know, I've watched you battle anxiety for years, and I always saw it as something that held you back. But looking at these designs, it's clear that your understanding of mental chaos is actually making you a better architect. His observation sparked a deeper realization. What if God's promise to be my clarity wasn't just about managing my own thoughts, but about using my experience with mental storms to help others find peace? What if my racing mind wasn't a bug in my design, but a feature that equipped me for specific kinds of service? That evening, I decided to attend a support group for adults dealing with anxiety that met at a local community center. I had seen their flyer weeks ago but had been too embarrassed to consider going. Now, with this new understanding of how personal struggle could become professional strength, I felt curious about connecting with others who shared similar experiences. The group was smaller than I expected, about 12 people sitting in a circle in a plain conference room. The facilitator, a counselor named Janet, welcomed newcomers and invited anyone to share how their week had been. As people began talking about their struggles with panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, and overwhelming worry, I felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. Sadness because these were fellow travelers carrying heavy burdens, and relief because I wasn't alone in this journey. When it was my turn to speak, I shared briefly about my experience with racing thoughts and the recent breakthrough I'd had with finding God's clarity in the midst of mental chaos. I used to think my anxiety was just a problem to solve, I said, but lately I'm wondering if it might also be a source of understanding that helps me serve others better. An older woman named Carol spoke up. That's beautiful. I've been dealing with anxiety for 40 years, and I've never thought about it as potentially useful. It's always just felt like a burden. What if it's both? Suggested a younger man named David. A burden that develops compassion, a struggle that creates empathy. The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful I'd had in months. People shared how their anxiety had made them more sensitive to others' pain, more aware of the need for kindness, more appreciative of small moments of peace. As I drove home from the group, I felt something shifting in my fundamental understanding of myself. The racing mind that had felt like my greatest weakness was revealing itself as a source of insight and compassion that could serve others. Over the next few days, this new perspective began influencing every aspect of my work. When Mrs. Peterson called with her usual litany of concerns about her house design, instead of absorbing her anxiety, I was able to recognize it and respond with patience and understanding. Mrs. Peterson, I can hear that you're feeling overwhelmed by all the decisions involved in this project. That's completely normal. Let's break this down into smaller pieces so it feels more manageable. By the end of the call, she was calmer, and I realized that my ability to recognize and address her anxiety came directly from my own experience with overwhelming thoughts. The breakthrough moment came during a team meeting about the pediatric wing design. As we reviewed the latest plans, Dr. Chen made a comment that stopped me in my tracks. Michael, I have to tell you something. We've worked with many architects over the years, but your designs show an understanding of the patient experience that's extraordinary. Every element seems designed with genuine empathy for what children and families go through in medical settings. Tom Rodriguez nodded in agreement. I've been in construction for 20 years, and I've never seen designs that so clearly prioritize emotional wellness alongside medical functionality. After the meeting, Dr. Martinez pulled me aside. "Michael, would you be interested in speaking at our next family support group meeting? We have parents dealing with children who have chronic illnesses, and many of them struggle with anxiety about medical procedures. I think your perspective on finding peace in the midst of worry could be really helpful." The invitation felt like another confirmation that God was transforming my struggle into service. "I'd be honored to help," I said. That night, I called Emma to share about the day's revelations. "Michael, do you realize what's happening?" she said, after I finished describing the week's events. "God is doing exactly what He promised. He's being your clarity, but He's also using your journey with anxiety to bring clarity to others." She was right. God's promise that He would be my clarity was proving to be multidimensional. Not only was He helping me navigate my own racing thoughts, but He was using my experience with mental chaos to help me create spaces and offer support that could bring peace to others facing similar struggles. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with anxiety had changed. What once felt like a personal failing now felt like preparation for ministry. The racing thoughts that used to torment me were becoming a source of insight that helped me serve others more effectively. "God," I prayed, "thank you for showing me that even my struggles can be transformed into strengths when they're surrendered to you. Thank you for being my clarity and for using my journey to bring clarity to others. Help me continue to see my anxiety through your eyes, not as a flaw to hide, but as an experience that can generate compassion and understanding." The thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Concerns about upcoming projects, questions about design decisions, the usual mental activity of an engaged mind. But now they felt different, not like enemies to defeat, but like raw material that God could use to create something beautiful and healing in the world. The evening I spoke to Dr. Martinez's family support group became a turning point in my understanding of how God uses our brokenness to heal others. As I sat in the hospital's family conference room, looking at the faces of parents whose children were battling serious illnesses, I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with something new, a sense of purpose that transcended my own comfort. "I want to start by being honest with you," I began, addressing the group of about 20 parents and caregivers. "I'm here not just as the architect designing your new pediatric wing, but as someone who understands what it feels like when your mind won't stop racing with worry." I shared my story, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming thoughts, the night God spoke to me about being my clarity. As I talked, I watched faces around the room shift from polite attention to recognition, from isolation to connection. A mother named Lisa spoke up first. "Thank you for being so open. I thought I was the only one who lay awake at night running through every possible scenario about my daughter's treatment. It helps to know that successful people struggle with racing thoughts too. The worst part," added a father named Marcus, "is that I feel guilty for being anxious when my son is the one who's actually sick. I should be strong for him, but instead I'm constantly worried about everything that could go wrong." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. Parent after parent shared their struggles with the anxiety that accompanies having a seriously ill child, the sleepless nights, the constant what-if thinking, the overwhelming nature of medical decisions. But as they talked, I began to see something beautiful happening. Each person's vulnerability gave others permission to be honest about their own struggles. The isolation that anxiety creates was being broken down by shared experience and mutual understanding. "Can I share something I've been learning?" I asked the group. "I used to think my racing thoughts were a sign of weakness or lack of faith, but lately I'm discovering that they're actually a sign of how much I care. The anxiety you feel about your children isn't a character flaw. It's a manifestation of deep love." A woman named Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. I've never thought about it that way. My constant worry feels like it's making everything worse, not better. What if the goal isn't to stop worrying completely, but to find God's voice of truth in the midst of the worry? I suggested. What if He can be our clarity, even when our minds are racing with concern for our children? I shared some practical strategies I'd been learning, how to identify which thoughts deserved attention and which ones could be acknowledged and released, how to ask God for His perspective on fear-based scenarios, how to anchor to His truth when emotions felt overwhelming. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing the discussion, spoke up. Michael, what you're describing aligns perfectly with what we know about anxiety management in medical settings. Research shows that acknowledging anxiety while accessing reliable sources of truth and support is much more effective than trying to eliminate worry entirely. After the formal meeting ended, several parents approached me individually. Marcus, the father who felt guilty about his anxiety, asked if we could talk privately. "I keep thinking I should be stronger for my son," he said, "but the truth is, I'm terrified. What if the treatment doesn't work? What if we lose him? What if I make the wrong decisions about his care? How do you find God's clarity when the stakes feel so high?" I looked at this man who was carrying one of the heaviest burdens imaginable, and I felt God's compassion flowing through me. "Marcus, what if your fear is actually evidence of your love? What if God can use your tender heart and your careful attention to help you make wise decisions for your son?" We talked for another 30 minutes about how his anxiety was actually making him a more engaged, more research-oriented, more advocate-minded parent. His racing thoughts, when guided by God's clarity, were helping him ask better questions, seek second opinions, and ensure his son received the best possible care. "I never thought about it that way," Marcus said as we concluded our conversation. "Maybe my anxiety isn't the enemy I thought it was." Driving home that night, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for how God was using my personal struggle to serve others. The support group experience had shown me that my journey with anxiety wasn't just about my own healing. It was preparation for ministry to others facing similar challenges. The next morning, Dr. Chen called with unexpected news. "Michael, I heard about your presentation to our family support group last night. The response has been incredible. Several parents have asked if you might consider doing a regular workshop series about managing anxiety in medical settings." My first thought was excitement, followed immediately by the familiar surge of anxious questions. What if I'm not qualified to teach others about anxiety? What if I say something harmful? What if I'm overstepping my professional boundaries? What if I'm not ready for this kind of responsibility? But instead of being overwhelmed by these thoughts, I found myself asking God for His clarity about this opportunity. The answer came as a calm, confident understanding. You're not being asked to be a therapist or medical professional. You're being asked to share your personal experience with finding peace in chaos. You're qualified because you've lived it, not because you have credentials. "I'd be interested in exploring that," I told Dr. Chen. "Let me think about how to structure something that would be genuinely helpful." Over the next few days, I found myself designing workshop content with the same passion I brought to architectural projects. I researched the intersection of faith and anxiety management, developed practical exercises for identifying God's voice above mental noise, and created frameworks for parents dealing with medical trauma. Jake noticed my enthusiasm during one of our planning meetings. "You're lighting up when you talk about this anxiety workshop idea. I haven't seen you this excited about anything in years. It's strange," I admitted. "I spent so many years being ashamed of my anxiety, trying to hide it or fix it. Now I'm considering making it a central part of how I serve others. It feels like God is redeeming my greatest struggle." "What if that's exactly what He does?" Jake suggested. "What if He takes the things that have caused us the most pain and transforms them into our greatest tools for helping others?" That evening, I called my grandmother to get her perspective on this new direction. "Grandma, I'm thinking about starting to speak publicly about anxiety and faith. Does that seem wise?" Am I qualified to help others when I'm still figuring things out myself? Her laugh was warm and knowing. Oh, sweetheart, who better to help people navigate a storm than someone who's learned to find shelter in the same storm? You don't have to have everything figured out to share what God has taught you. She paused, then continued with the wisdom of 8 decades. Michael, I've been watching you grow for 31 years. Your tender heart and your careful mind, the very things that make you anxious, also make you uniquely equipped to understand and help others who struggle with overwhelming thoughts. Her affirmation gave me the confidence I needed to move forward. Over the next week, I developed a proposal for a monthly workshop series called Finding Clarity in Chaos, Faith-Based Approaches to Managing Anxiety in Medical Settings. When I presented the idea to Dr. Chen and Dr. Martinez, their response was enthusiastic. This fills a gap we've been trying to address for years, Dr. Martinez said. Medical care addresses the physical aspects of illness, but families need support for the emotional and spiritual challenges too. As I prepared for the first workshop, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that desperate night when God spoke to me. What had started as a personal crisis had become a calling to serve others facing similar struggles. God, I prayed, thank you for showing me that you really are my clarity, not just for my own racing thoughts, but for understanding how to help others find peace in chaos too. Use my story, my struggles, and my ongoing journey to bring hope to other people who feel overwhelmed by worry. The racing thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Now they included excitement about the workshops, concerns about doing them well, questions about the best approaches to take. But they felt like collaborative thoughts now, like God and I were working together to transform my experience with chaos into tools for bringing clarity to others. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to see how God continued to use my greatest weakness as a source of strength for serving others, and I couldn't wait to discover what He had prepared. 3 months into leading the monthly anxiety workshops at the hospital, I faced a crisis that would test everything I had learned about trusting God's clarity in the midst of chaos. It began with a phone call at 6:30 a.m. on a Monday morning from Jake, and the panic in his voice immediately set my mind racing. Michael, we have a serious problem. The city inspector found structural issues with the Pediatric Wing Foundation. They're talking about stopping construction completely until we can prove the building is safe. My mind immediately launched into catastrophic mode. Structural issues. How is that possible? What if the entire foundation has to be rebuilt? What if the project is cancelled? What if we're liable for the delays and costs? What if this destroys our reputation? What if no one trusts us with major projects again? What if the business fails? What if families who were counting on this new facility have to wait months or years longer? But even as the thoughts spiraled, I found myself reaching for the anchor that had become my lifeline over the past months. God, I need your clarity right now. Help me see this situation clearly, not through the lens of panic. Jake, I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Let's gather all the information before we decide what this means. The drive to the construction site was a battle between panic and peace. My mind continued generating worst-case scenarios, but underneath the mental noise, I felt a quiet confidence that God would provide clarity even in this crisis. At the site, Tom Rodriguez, the construction manager, showed us the area of concern. A city inspector had found some irregular settling in one section of the foundation that didn't match the engineering specifications. The good news, Tom explained, is that this is localized to about a 20-foot section. The bad news is that we can't proceed until we understand why it happened and ensure it won't compromise the building's integrity. As we examined the situation, my racing mind actually became an asset. Instead of being paralyzed by the potential problems, I found myself thinking through multiple approaches to diagnosis and resolution. What if we bring in a structural engineer for an independent assessment? What if we use ground-penetrating radar to check the soil composition under this section? What if this is related to an old foundation or utility line that wasn't detected in the original site survey? Jake looked at me with amazement. Michael, I expected you to be in full panic mode right now. Instead, you're problem-solving. How are you so calm? I'm not calm, I admitted. My mind is racing with all the potential disasters this could create, but I'm learning to use God's clarity to sort through the noise and focus on productive thoughts instead of just fearful ones. Over the next several hours, we coordinated with engineers, soil specialists, and city officials to understand the scope of the problem. By afternoon, we had a preliminary assessment. The settling was caused by an old underground storage tank that hadn't been properly documented, creating a void in the soil that affected foundation stability. The solution would require additional engineering work and some reconstruction, but the project could continue. The timeline would be delayed by about 6 weeks, and costs would increase, but the building could be completed safely. That evening, I had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of my professional career, explaining the situation to Dr. Chen and the hospital board. Dr. Chen, I need to update you on a situation that arose today at the construction site, I began, my heart racing with anxiety about her reaction. As I explained the structural issue, the delay, and the additional costs, I watched my mind generate every possible negative response she might have. But instead of being controlled by those thoughts, I found myself staying anchored to the truth of what we were actually dealing with. Michael, Dr. Chen said when I finished, I appreciate your honesty and the speed with which you've addressed this situation. These kinds of unexpected issues happen in construction, especially when dealing with older urban sites. What matters is how you handle them. Her response was far more understanding than my anxiety had predicted. We spent another 30 minutes discussing the revised timeline and budget adjustments, and by the end of the call, I felt like we had actually strengthened our working relationship through transparent communication about a difficult situation. The real test came the next day, during my anxiety workshop at the hospital. Several of the regular attendees had heard about the construction delay, and I knew they would be watching to see how I handled my own crisis while teaching others about finding peace in chaos. Before we begin today, I said to the group of about 15 parents and caregivers, I want to share something that happened yesterday that gave me a chance to practice what we've been discussing about finding God's clarity in stressful situations. I told them about the foundation issue, the initial panic, and the process of working through the crisis while trying to stay anchored to truth rather than fear. My first reaction was exactly what yours might be in a medical crisis with your children, I explained. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, but I've been learning that our first thoughts don't have to be our final thoughts. We can acknowledge the fear and then ask God for his perspective on what's actually happening. Lisa, a mother whose daughter was undergoing cancer treatment, spoke up. That's exactly what I needed to hear today. We got some test results yesterday that weren't what we hoped for, and I spent all night imagining the worst possible outcomes. But you're right, those first fearful thoughts don't have to be the final word. The discussion that followed was one of the most honest and helpful we'd had. Parents shared their own experiences of working through crisis moments, learning to distinguish between productive concern and destructive worry, and finding God's peace in the midst of genuine uncertainty. Marcus, the father I had spoken with after my first presentation, shared a breakthrough he'd experienced. I used to think that trusting God meant not being worried about my son's condition. But I'm learning that faith isn't about the absence of concern. It's about believing that God's love and wisdom are bigger than my fears. After the workshop, Dr. Martinez pulled me aside. Michael, what you shared today about handling your own crisis while teaching others about anxiety management was incredibly powerful. You didn't pretend to have it all figured out. You showed them what it looks like to apply these principles in real time. Dumbly, her observation helped me realize something important about the ministry that was developing through these workshops. I wasn't serving as an expert who had conquered anxiety, but as a fellow traveler who was learning to navigate it with God's help. That evening, as I reflected on the day's events, I marveled at how God had used a professional crisis to deepen the impact of my personal ministry. The foundation problem that could have been a disaster had become a teaching moment about finding stability in the midst of uncertainty. I called Emma to share about the day's revelations. "It's amazing," I told her. "Yesterday's crisis actually strengthened my relationship with the hospital team and gave me a real-time example to share in the anxiety workshop. God really did use a potential disaster as an opportunity for growth and service." "That's exactly what God does," Emma replied. "He takes what looks like a setback and transforms it into a setup for something better. Your foundation crisis became a foundation for deeper ministry." As I prepared for bed, I thought about the past 3 months of leading workshops, the relationships that had formed with anxious parents, and the ways God continued to use my personal struggles to serve others. "God," I prayed, "thank you for being my clarity, not just in peaceful moments, but especially in crisis situations. Thank you for showing me that my anxiety doesn't disqualify me from helping others. It actually equips me to understand and serve people who are struggling with overwhelming thoughts and fears." The racing thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Concerns about the construction project, excitement about next month's workshop, questions about how to continue growing in this unexpected ministry. But they felt like collaborative thoughts now, like God and I were partnering together to transform my experience with mental chaos into tools for bringing His peace to others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to practice living with God's clarity in the midst of uncertainty, and I found myself genuinely excited to see how He would continue to use my racing mind as an instrument of His peace. 9 months after God first spoke those transformative words to my racing mind, I stood in the completed pediatric wing of the medical center, watching children and families experience the healing environment we had designed. The space was everything we had envisioned, bright, welcoming, with interactive elements that gave young patients a sense of control and wonder in the midst of medical treatment. But the most profound transformation wasn't in the building. It was in my understanding of how God uses our deepest struggles to serve His greatest purposes. As I watched a 7-year-old girl named Sophie confidently walk down the corridor toward her treatment room, stopping to touch the interactive wall display that responded with gentle music and colorful patterns, I realized that my journey with anxiety had been essential preparation for creating this space. Dr. Martinez found me standing in the family lounge, observing how parents and children were interacting with the environment we had designed. "Michael, I've been meaning to tell you something," she said. "We've had this wing open for 3 weeks now, and the feedback from families has been extraordinary. But more than that, we've seen measurable differences in anxiety levels for both children and parents compared to our old facilities." She showed me survey results that demonstrated significant improvements in patient comfort, family satisfaction, and even treatment compliance. "The design elements you incorporated based on your understanding of anxiety management are making a real difference in healing outcomes." As we talked, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The sleepless nights, the overwhelming thoughts, the desperate prayer that led to God's promise of clarity, all of it had been preparation for this ministry of creating healing environments and supporting anxious families. That afternoon, I received a call that would open an entirely new chapter in this unexpected ministry. Dr. Rebecca Chen was on the line with an opportunity I hadn't anticipated. "Michael, I've been contacted by the State Medical Association about your anxiety workshops. Word has spread about the support you're providing to families, and they want to know if you'd be willing to present at their annual conference about integrating mental health support into medical facility design." My mind immediately began its familiar dance of questions and concerns. Present at a state conference? What if I'm not qualified? What if I don't know enough about medical facility design standards? What if my personal experience isn't enough to warrant speaking to professionals? What if I embarrass myself or misrepresent the hospital? But just as quickly, I found myself accessing God's clarity in the midst of the mental storm. God, what's the truth here? Am I being called to share this story on a larger platform? The answer came as a peaceful confidence. You're not being asked to be an expert on medical design. You're being asked to share how personal experience with anxiety informed design choices that are helping people heal. That's exactly what you're qualified to speak about. I'd be honored to participate, I told Dr. Chen. Preparing for the conference presentation became an opportunity to reflect on the full scope of how God had transformed my relationship with anxiety over the past months. I wasn't cured of racing thoughts. They still came regularly, especially in high-stress situations, but I had learned to work with them rather than against them, to use God's clarity to sort through them productively. The presentation day arrived with all the nervous energy I expected, but this time the anxiety felt different, more like excitement mixed with purpose than pure fear. As I stood before an audience of 200 medical professionals, architects and facility designers, I felt God's peace undergirding my racing thoughts. I want to start with a confession, I began. A year ago, I never would have imagined standing here talking about anxiety and design because I was deeply ashamed of my own struggles with racing thoughts and overwhelming worry. Today, I want to share how God transformed my greatest weakness into a tool for serving others. I told the complete story. The sleepless nights, the desperate prayer, God's promise to be my clarity, and the gradual discovery that my experience with anxiety was actually equipping me to design healing environments and support struggling families. The pediatric wing we completed isn't just a building, I explained. It's a physical embodiment of lessons learned in the midst of mental chaos about what brings peace, what creates safety, and what helps people feel less alone in their struggles. The response was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, medical professionals shared their own experiences with anxiety. Facility designers asked about specific elements that supported mental wellness, and several people inquired about consulting opportunities for future projects. After the presentation, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychiatrist who specialized in medical trauma, approached me with a proposal that would expand this ministry even further. Michael, what you've shared today represents a gap we've been trying to fill in medical facility design. Would you be interested in partnering with our organization to develop standards for anxiety-informed design in medical settings? The opportunity felt like another confirmation of God's faithfulness to the promise he had made in my kitchen that desperate night. He wasn't just being my clarity, he was using my journey to bring clarity and healing to others on a scale I never could have imagined. That evening I called my parents to share about the day's events and the potential partnership Dr. Walsh had proposed. Michael, my father said, I've been watching your journey this past year, and I'm amazed at how God has used your struggle for his glory. But what impresses me most is that you haven't forgotten where you came from. You're still the same careful, thoughtful person, but now your anxiety serves others instead of just tormenting you. His words touched something deep in my heart. The racing mind that had once felt like a prison had become a gift. Not because the thoughts stopped coming, but because I had learned to channel them through God's wisdom toward productive purposes. Over the next week, I found myself praying about the direction this unexpected ministry was taking. The architectural firm was thriving, the pediatric wing project had led to other medical facility contracts, and now there were opportunities to influence design standards on a national level. During one of my regular visits to the anxiety support group at the community center, I shared about these developments and asked for their perspective. Michael, said Carol, the woman who had been dealing with anxiety for 40 years, watching your journey this year has given me hope that my struggles might have purpose too. You've shown us that God really can use our brokenness to heal others. David, the young man who had suggested anxiety might be both burden and gift, added, "What you've accomplished isn't about overcoming anxiety. It's about surrendering it to God's purposes. That's available to all of us, regardless of our circumstances." Their insights helped me realize that the ministry developing through my architectural work and workshops wasn't just about my personal calling. It was about demonstrating a principle that could transform how anyone approached their struggles. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 9 months. From desperate prayers on a kitchen floor to speaking at state conferences, from feeling ashamed of racing thoughts to using them to design healing environments, God's faithfulness to his promise had exceeded every expectation. "God," I prayed, "you said you would be my clarity, and you have been faithful beyond anything I could have imagined. Thank you for not taking away my racing mind, but for teaching me to partner with you in using it for healing and hope. Show me how to continue growing in this calling while staying grounded in the truth that my worth comes from your love, not from my achievements." The thoughts were still there as I drifted off to sleep. Excitement about future projects, concerns about living up to new responsibilities, questions about how to balance this expanding ministry with my architectural practice. But they felt like creative energy now, like raw material that God could shape into something beautiful and useful for his kingdom. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to see how God continued to transform my greatest struggle into his instrument of peace for others, and I fell asleep with deep gratitude for the mystery of how he works all things together for good. 1 year after God spoke those life-changing words to my racing mind, I found myself standing in the lobby of the new National Center for Anxiety and Medical Trauma, the first facility in the country designed entirely around principles of anxiety-informed architecture. As families moved through the space, parents with calmer expressions, children engaging confidently with interactive elements, staff working in an environment that supported both caregivers and patients, I was overwhelmed with gratitude for how God had transformed my deepest struggle into a calling that was touching lives across the nation. The center was the culmination of 12 months of extraordinary growth and partnership with Dr. Walsh's organization. What had started as a desperate prayer in my kitchen had become a movement that was changing how medical facilities approached mental wellness in their design and programming. Jake stood beside me, reviewing the final construction documents as we prepared for the official opening ceremony. "Michael, do you remember that night you called me panicking about your racing thoughts? If someone had told us then that your anxiety would become the foundation for a national center helping others, I would have thought they were crazy." I laughed, remembering how impossible this outcome would have seemed during those dark months of constant worry. The strangest part is that my mind still races with thoughts and concerns. But now, instead of feeling like a victim of my own mental activity, I feel like I'm partnering with God to channel it towards something meaningful. As if to prove my point, my mind was actively generating thoughts even in this moment of celebration. What if the center doesn't live up to expectations? What if families don't respond as positively as we hope? What if I've oversold the impact of design on anxiety management? What if this becomes a source of pressure rather than peace? But alongside these familiar concerns, I heard the steady voice of God's clarity. "You've done faithful work, based on real experience and genuine care for others. The outcome is in my hands. Trust the process you've learned to trust." The opening ceremony began with remarks from Dr. Walsh, who had become not just a professional partner, but a dear friend over the past months. As she spoke about the vision for the center and the unique approach to anxiety-informed design, I found myself marveling at how God had orchestrated every connection and opportunity. Today represents a new chapter in how we address mental health in medical settings. Dr. Walsh said to the gathered crowd of medical professionals, families, and community leaders, But this center exists because one architect was brave enough to share his personal struggle with anxiety and wise enough to let that struggle inform his professional calling. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium with the familiar mixture of nervous energy and peaceful confidence that had become my normal state. My mind was racing with concerns about saying the right things, representing the project well, and honoring all the people who had contributed to this moment. "A year ago," I began, "I was sitting on my kitchen floor at 3 a.m., overwhelmed by racing thoughts and desperate for peace. In that moment, God spoke to my heart with words that changed everything. 'Michael, your mind doesn't stop, but I am your clarity.' I shared the complete journey, the initial breakthrough, the challenges of learning to trust God's voice above mental noise, the discovery that my anxiety could become a tool for serving others, and the gradual unfolding of a calling I never could have imagined. This center exists not because I conquered anxiety, but because I learned to surrender it to God's purposes," I continued. "Every design element here, from the natural lighting that reduces institutional stress, to the interactive features that give patients a sense of control, to the quiet spaces where families can retreat when feeling overwhelmed, came from understanding what it feels like to need peace in the midst of chaos." The audience response was deeply moving. After my presentation, person after person approached to share their own struggles with anxiety, their gratitude for environments that supported mental wellness, and their hope that this model would spread to other facilities. But the most meaningful interaction came from a 12-year-old boy named Alex, who was at the center with his mother for anxiety counseling related to a chronic medical condition. "Mr. Michael," he said, tugging on my sleeve, "my mom told me you used to be scared a lot like me. Is that true?" I knelt down to his eye level. "Yes, Alex, my mind still has lots of worried thoughts, especially when I don't know what's going to happen next. But you're not scared to talk to all those people," he observed, gesturing toward the crowd. "You're right. I still get nervous, but I've learned that God is bigger than my scared feelings. He helps me know what's true, even when my thoughts are spinning around." Alex considered this for a moment. "So maybe my worried thoughts don't mean I'm broken?" "They definitely don't mean you're broken," I assured him. "They might mean you care a lot about things, and God can help you figure out which worries are important and which ones you can let go." His mother, standing nearby, had tears in her eyes. "Alex has been so ashamed of his anxiety. Thank you for helping him see it differently." That evening, as I walked through the center one final time before leaving, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The racing thoughts were still there. Excitement about the center's future, concerns about maintaining the quality of programs, questions about what opportunities might emerge next. But the mental activity no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it felt like creative energy that God could direct toward purposes I was still discovering. My mind's tendency to see multiple possibilities, to consider various angles, to think through complex scenarios. All of this was serving the mission of bringing hope and healing to people struggling with anxiety. I found myself in the center's meditation room, a quiet space designed for reflection and prayer. Sitting in the comfortable chair positioned near a window overlooking a peaceful garden, I whispered a prayer of gratitude that encompassed the entire journey. "God, you said you would be my clarity, and you have been faithful beyond anything I could have imagined. You didn't take away my racing mind. You transformed it into an instrument of your peace. You didn't cure my anxiety. You redeemed it for purposes I'm still discovering." I thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with mine over this year, Dr. Martinez and the pediatric patients who would benefit from healing environments, the parents in the support groups who found hope in shared struggle, the professionals who were implementing anxiety-informed design in their own facilities. Thank you for showing me that our deepest struggles can become our greatest tools for serving others when they're surrendered to your purposes. Help me continue to trust your clarity above the noise in my head, and use my story to bring hope to others who feel overwhelmed by their own thoughts. As I prepared to leave the center that night, I encountered Marcus, the father from the original support group, whose son had been battling illness. He was touring the facility with his family, including his son who was now in remission. "Michael, I had to come see this place," Marcus said. "A year ago, you helped me realize that my anxiety about my son's health was actually love in disguise. Now look what God has done with your own anxiety. He's created a place where hundreds of families will find the same hope you helped me discover." His words captured the essence of what I had learned over this transformative year. God's promise to be my clarity wasn't just about managing my personal mental health. It was about using my experience with chaos to help others find peace, using my struggle with overwhelming thoughts to create environments and ministries that brought calm to other racing minds. Driving home that night, I marveled at the faithfulness of God's promise. The words he had spoken to me that desperate night, "Your mind doesn't stop, but I am your clarity," had proven true in dimensions I never could have imagined. My mind was indeed still active, still generating thoughts and concerns and possibilities at a rapid pace. But I had learned to work with this mental energy rather than against it, to channel it through God's wisdom toward productive purposes, to use it as a tool for understanding and serving others who struggled with similar challenges. As I pulled into my driveway, I whispered one final prayer. "God, whatever tomorrow brings, help me to remember that you are my clarity. Whether my thoughts are loud or quiet, whether I feel peaceful or anxious, you remain my steady source of truth and direction. Use my racing mind to bring your peace to a world that desperately needs it." The thoughts were still there as I prepared for bed. Excitement about the center's first week of operation, gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point, anticipation for whatever new opportunities God might open. But they felt like collaborative thoughts now, like God and I were working together to see how my experience with mental chaos could continue bringing clarity and hope to others. Tomorrow would bring new chances to live out the truth that God really is our clarity in the midst of any storm, mental, emotional, or circumstantial. And I fell asleep with profound peace, knowing that racing thoughts were no longer my enemy, but my partner in serving a God who transforms our deepest struggles into his greatest tools for healing a broken world. The mind may never stop, but God's clarity is always available, always reliable, always sufficient for whatever challenges tomorrow may bring.